Here we have some more questions on the topic membrane transport. So let's just get started. What is the function of proteins in passive transport? So we know passive transport is one example of membrane transport. Now, proteins can have many different types of functions. Some proteins can be involved in membrane transport. Others are involved in making your muscles. Others are involved in making DNA, right? So proteins can have many different types of functions depending on which one we're talking about. So what is the function of a protein that's involved in passive transport? So we know that's going to be like these proteins, the ones in the membrane controlling what goes in and what goes out, right? So is it A, to serve as electron carriers in the membrane? Well, no, they don't carry, these are not, these proteins, there are proteins that are electron carriers in the membrane, but these ones in passive transport do not carry electrons. Okay, so it's not wrong to say that proteins can be electron carriers, but the proteins in passive transport are not electron carriers. They don't carry electrons. That's not their purpose. So what about B? To interact with hormones to influence cell activity. So that would be these glycoproteins here, not those involved in transport. So these here are called glycoproteins, and they interact with other cells and hormones, communicating with each other, but these are not involved in passive transport. So that's why that one is wrong. So C, to serve as channels so that specific molecules can diffuse across the membrane. That sounds right. These proteins can serve as channels in passive transport, meaning no energy is required, so it's got to be facilitated diffusion, so that molecules can travel through it. So yeah, that sounds right. Could be C, but let's just look at D before we confirm that. To release energy from ATP so that specific substances can cross the membrane. Okay, so there in this one it's saying using ATP, but we know passive transport, hence the name, means no energy required. So we know active transport would require ATP. So this statement would be more related to active transport, which uses a protein in the membrane that pumps stuff against a concentration gradient using ATP. But passive transport doesn't need ATP. It's free of charge, basically. So that's why it's not D. So the answer will be C. So again, these are tough questions. So if you don't understand what I'm saying, the purpose of these videos are really not for me to explain in detail, because I made teaching videos for that reason. So here I'm just running through some questions to help you out and guide you a little bit. But otherwise, these videos would be an hour long if I explained every single detail. So let's go on to the next one. Which process is possible due to the fluidity of cell membrane? So remember, our cell membrane is not like a wall. It's not like rigid and tough. It moves, it bends. It's kind of like a jelly-like substance. So what process is possible because of this bending? I'll tell you right now. The answer is endocytosis or exocytosis, because the membrane, due to the fluidity, remember the fluidity is thanks to these cholesterol molecules. They help make the membrane more fluid. So due to this fluidity, the membrane is able to kind of ingest or engulf these larger objects like bacteria so that they don't infect you, or other molecules and things like that. Okay, so that's why it's very useful for this membrane to be bendy. So the answer will be endocytosis or exocytosis, but exocytosis is not here. So it's going to be A, but let's check out these other ones. B, osmosis. So osmosis is a process that happens that is water molecules flowing through this membrane channel. So the membrane doesn't need to be fluid for that. All you need is a protein for that. So how about ATP production? Okay, so ATP production, if you look at a cell, happens in the mitochondria. Okay, it happens inside the matrix, the inner side of the mitochondria. No membrane fluidity is required for that. It just needs a bunch of proteins and it needs a membrane, but the membrane doesn't need to be fluid for that. So ATP production doesn't require that. Cell recognition, all you need for cell recognition, like I said, is these things here, these glycoproteins. That way cells can communicate, but the membrane doesn't need to be fluid for that. No point in that. So therefore the answer is going to be A. Okay, so here they ask you a question that requires you to know well two of the types of membrane transport, diffusion and osmosis. So what do diffusion and osmosis have in common? So we know diffusion is the process by which molecules move down. So diffusion is simply called, in another way, simple diffusion. So simple diffusion can be also called simply diffusion, like without symbol. So diffusion is the process of molecules moving down the concentration gradient from an area from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration across a membrane without a protein required. So all it needs is the phospholipid bilayer, no protein needed. So that's basically what diffusion is. And osmosis is the process by which water moves across the membrane through a water channel, so a protein channel, in order to dilute or make both sides equal in concentration, right? But both of these do not need energy, remember? I made them green here because they're both passive processes. Only active transport requires energy. So they're both passive. They happen by themselves, don't need any form of energy. So, is it A, they only happen in living cells? So this is not true because sometimes osmosis can happen in other scenarios without needing for it to be in living cells. Osmosis is simply just a movement of water. It doesn't necessarily need to happen in living things. So that's the confusion here. Don't only consider it to happen in living things. They require transport proteins in the membrane. Osmosis does, but diffusion doesn't. Remember, we just talked about that. Diffusion doesn't need, it just needs the phospholipid bilayer. That's why it's not B. C, they are passive transport mechanisms. See, this is the one that makes it right. They are both passive. They don't need energy or ATP. So why is it not D? Net movement of substances is against the concentration gradient. No, this sentence is describing active transport against the concentration gradient. Whereas we know diffusion is down the concentration gradient from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So the answer here has got to be what? It's got to be C. Okay, we got one more here. This one is interesting. So, what does facilitated diffusion across a cell membrane require? So remember, normally when I always emphasize this, when we think about any type of membrane transport mechanism, you got to think of three things. You got to think of these three things. Does it need a protein? Does it need a concentration gradient? And does it need ATP? If you can answer these, yes or no, then you'll know which one we're talking about. So, what does facilitated diffusion need? Facilitated diffusion needs a protein channel. It needs a protein. It is also a passive process, which means it doesn't need ATP, which means the only way things can move is naturally, and things only move naturally from an area down a concentration gradient, so an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So it needs a protein channel, it needs a concentration gradient, and because it has a concentration gradient, it doesn't need ATP. So let's look here what they have. A pore protein, pore just means like a hole or a channel, so it's a channel protein. So does it need them? Yes, it does. We automatically know it's going to be A or C. We've eliminated B and D already. Now, does it need ATP? No, because it has a concentration gradient. So it's going to be yes, no, and no. No. It's going to be yes, no, and yes. So yes, no, and yes. So it's going to be C. And you can kind of experiment with this and do it with other types of transport and see what answers you come up with. But for this one, it'd be C. So that's it for this one. And I'm going to make another part where I do 5 more multiple choice questions. The more you can do, the better. I promise you that. Your teachers will use these over and over again. They won't make up their own ones. They're going to pick IB ones. So the more you can do, the better.